Assalamualaikum and hi. Today I will briefly talk about international migration, focusing on the Venezuelan refugee crisis. People migrate for many reasons, some for work or study, others because they are forced to flee due to violence, conflict or disaster. Those who fleeing for safety are called refugees, protected under international law like the 1951 Refugee Convention and the Cartagena Declaration in Latin America. The Venezuelan crisis, starting around 2014 until 2015, is one of the largest recent examples of forced migration. Economic collapse, political unrest, and shortages forced millions to leave. Countries like Colombia offered legal support to help them. UNHCR provide legal aid, documents, and works with governments to protect refugees' rights. They also coordinate support through a platform called R4V. The IOM help at borders, offering food, shelters, and support for the long-term integration like job training. As Sotelo 2023 notes, this institution help ensure migrants are treated with dignity. In short, the Venezuelan crisis shows how vital international cooperation is supporting refugees and managing migration. Thank you.
Today, I'll be explaining the root causes and major conflicts surrounding the Venezuelan refugee crisis. The crisis, which accelerated around early 2015, is far more than a humanitarian emergency. It stems from a combination of political, economic, and institutional failures. After the death of Hugo Chavez, Venezuela fell under the authoritarian rule of Nicolas Maduro. His government became known for its inefficient economic management and widespread repression of political opposition. This included the imprisonment of opposition leaders and violent suppression of mass protests, which led to a serious decline in human rights. These authoritarian practices severely weakened democratic institutions and damaged public trust. This was a major reason behind the first wave of forced migration, as many Venezuelans fled to escape political instability and repression. Economically, Venezuela suffered one of the worst collapses in Latin American history. Hyperinflation became extreme, public services crumbled, and even basic necessities like food and medicine become inaccessible to average citizens. The crisis became a multi-dimensional threat to survival. As millions fled the country, neighboring nations like Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador bore the brunt of the mass migration. While they initially responded with humanitarian gestures, they soon faced serious backlash. Public services became overwhelmed and tension rose between citizens and migrants. At the regional level, the response was inconsistent. As Biancoli and Trevino Salaba explained, despite frameworks like the Global Compact for Migration, cooperation between South American governments remained weak. National interests kept shifting and institutions lacked the strength to coordinate response or protect migrants effectively. International organizations like the UNHCR and IOM did step in, offering aid and advocating for protections under agreements like the Cartagena Declaration. But their efforts were often limited because international law doesn't offer strong protections for people fleeing economic collapse or generalized violence.
I would like to talk about how the United Nations responded to the Venezuelan refugee crisis and then share some proposed solutions to help solve the crisis. First, let's take a look at what the UN has already done. One of their biggest interventions was large-scale humanitarian aid. Between 2020 and 2023, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, distributed essentials like clean drinking water, hygiene kits, blankets, and food packages to Venezuelan refugees, even during the COVID-19 pandemic. In Bolivar, for example, more than 7,000 vulnerable people received specialized kits, such as habitat kits, agricultural tools, school kits, and wash supplies. Besides emergency aid, housing was also a priority. UNHCR built 13 temporary shelters in Brazil to accommodate about 6,000 people and another center in Colombia for 1,400 people with food, water, and healthcare services. They also started over 1,000 housing projects by 2021, including culturally appropriate housing and safe houses for women, and expanded rental assistance to improve stability. Finally, the UN worked on legal residency and socio-economic integration. They helped improve asylum registration systems and supported refugees in getting legal documents, accessing jobs, and using public services. This was crucial in places like Peru and Colombia, where Venezuelans often faced xenophobia and could not find formal work. This right-based and sustainable approach aimed to help refugees build independent lives despite funding and political challenges. Next, we have some suggested solutions that can be applied to help with the refugee crisis in Venezuela. First, border management and security controls can be considered. For example, Austria introduced emergency laws that allowed them to temporarily stop asylum seekers at the border to manage surges of migrations, while countries like Finland and Russia restricted certain border crossings. And Germany, Norway, and Sweden reintroduced border checks during high influx periods. Although security must be balanced with human rights, these steps help maintain order and preparedness. Second, international cooperation and burden sharing can really make a difference. A good example is the EU-Turkey agreement from 2016, where for each Syrian refugee returned to Turkey, another Syrian was legally resettled in the EU. Plus, the EU gave 6 billion euros to Turkey to strengthen their refugee hosting capacity. This deal reduced irregular migration and promoted shared responsibility across the region. Lastly, we can look at cash-based assistance instead of physical goods. In Lebanon, for example, direct cash transfers allowed refugees to choose their own priorities and supported the local economy. Research showed that child labor dropped, school attendance rose, and each dollar given created over $2 in economic value. This approach respects refugee dignity and provides a scalable, efficient way to deliver aid.
International law is very important to protect the rights and safety for refugees. In South America, one of the biggest refugee problems is the Venezuela crisis, which started around 2014. Millions of Venezuelans left country because of bad economy, political problems, and human rights violations under Nicolas Maduro's government. More than 7 million people fled to nearby countries like Colombia, Peru, and Brazil for safety. Even though many of not officially called refugees under the 1951 Refugee Convention, these countries still help them using international law. One of important principles is non-refoulement from Article 33 of the 1951 Refugee Convention. It means countries cannot send back refugees back to where their life or freedom would be in danger. For Venezuelans, many fled because of hunger, hyperinflation, and repression. Colombia respects this principle by giving them temporary protection status, letting 1.7 million Venezuelans stay, work, and get service for 10 years, even though they are not officially refugees. Another important law is the Cartagena Declaration of 1984, which is used in Latin America. This declaration gives wider definition of refugees, not just people who face personal persecution, but also those escaping violence, human rights violations, or public safety problems. Many Venezuelans left because of economic collapse and shortage, not personal threats. Countries like Peru and Ecuador use this broader definition to help them. Lastly, the Global Compact on Refugee (GCR) approved in 2018 encouraged international cooperation to help refugees and the countries that host them. Even though it's not legally binding, it's helped share responsibility. For Venezuela's international agencies like UNHCR and IOM support them and their host country through a program called R4V, giving aid and resources. This international law and agreement show that even if Venezuelans don't meet the strict definition of refugees, they still get protection, safety, and dignity thanks to the efforts of neighboring country and the international community.
Next, I'll be explaining how the Venezuelan refugee crisis that began in 2015 has impacted Venezuela's international political economy. Once considered a wealthy oil exporting nation, Venezuela is now facing economic collapse, political instability, and one of the largest refugee crises in recent history. This issue have not only affected the country domestically but also changed its position in the global system. Economically, Venezuela was highly dependent on oil, which made made up over 90% of its exports, when global oil prices dropped after 2014 and with years of mismanagement in the state oil company PDVSA, production declined drastically. This led to hyperinflation, shortage of basic goods, and widespread poverty. Millions of Venezuelans began to flee the country, creating a massive refugee crisis. On the political side, international sanctions have played a major role. Countries like the US, Canada, and members of the EU impose sanctions targeting Venezuela oil industry, financial sectors, and government officials. These sanctions isolated Venezuela from the global economy and pushed it closer to authoritarian allies like Russia and China. Venezuela was also suspended from regional organizations like Mercosur due to democratic violations. The refugee crisis also weakened Venezuela's ability to maintain regional cooperation. Before the crisis, it led initiatives like Petrocaribe and ALBA, using oil to strengthen ties in Latin America, but with the collapse of oil production and political pressure, these programs were cut. This created a leadership gap in the region, which was quickly filled by other global powers. In conclusion, the crisis has reshaped Venezuela's international role, damaging its economy, isolating it politically, and weakening the global influence. That's all from me. Thank you.
In conclusion, the Venezuelan refugee crisis is more than just a migration issue. It's a powerful example of how political and economic collapse within one country can have global effects. What started as a local crisis became an international challenge as a million fled in search of safety, food, and a better future. Organizations like UNHCR and IOM stepped in to provide emergency aid, legal protection, and long-term support. Even when many Venezuelans did not fit the classic refugee definition, their efforts, guided by international framework like the Cartagena Declaration, have made a real difference. At the same time, host countries have struggled with pressure on public service and political tension, while Venezuela continues to face debt isolation and economic collapse. This crisis shows us that migration is not just about giving aid, but about finding lasting solutions through legal right, cooperation, and shared responsibility. Above all, it reminds us that human dignity and strong global partnership are essential in responding to modern displacement. That's all for me. Thank you.